What happens when a beloved franchise forgets what made it so special? Well, after the launch of its first game in 2007, Assassin's Creed quickly became one of the biggest gaming franchises. It truly was a great example of what you can expect from an impactful next-gen leap. It had great visuals, intriguing historical settings, fun gameplay, and an engaging narrative, with characters that you actually cared about. But once Assassin's Creed became an established series, it didn't take long for Ubisoft to expand the franchise. From new releases pretty much every single year to a complete shift of focus from quality to quantity. Corporate interests took over, which deviated the franchise from its original vision and moved us to a scenario where profits came first and relevance and creativity came later. As generations evolved, we had more and more games in the franchise, and we saw a series losing its way due to a combination of factors. It just felt like it wasn't Assassin's Creed anymore. And throughout the years, the community has always asked for a game set in Japan. But little did we know that when it finally happened, it would turn into one of the most controversial moments in the series. And Ubisoft seemed so insecure about their latest creation that they cancelled their presentation at the Tokyo Game Show and delayed the game. As a longtime fan of the franchise, it's time to take a look at the decline of Assassin's Creed and how Ubisoft's corporate greed didn't just hurt the series, but even Ubisoft itself. When it comes to the first Assassin's Creed, I feel like it's important to contextualize how impactful it was. We were just moving away from the 6th gen, and Assassin's Creed really felt like everything you expect from a next-gen leap. It looked incredible with a rich open world that would make you intrigued and interested in exploring. It had great parkour mechanics and a focus on stealth over a traditional action-packed game. It was immersive, it was fun, and the story was really interesting. You just couldn't put your controller down. You had Altair as your historical character and Desmond in the present day, and you really wanted to know what was going on. It wasn't perfect, there were some rough edges and some parts that seemed a bit repetitive, but the groundwork was laid out. And Ubisoft did manage to come up with great sequels, and Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood, Revelations, and Assassin's Creed 3 managed to keep things going strong. They brought us from the Third Crusade to the Italian Renaissance and even the American Revolution. Again, evolving the story of Desmond from the Ezio trilogy to Kenway and Connor, as well as interesting real-life side characters, and doing a great job of keeping us engaged and showing us the intricacies of the never-ending struggles between the Templars and the Assassins. To be fair, the games were starting to feel a little repetitive, but as a package, the Desmond storyline works really well. The open world design felt interesting, alive, and worth exploring. You really felt like you were taking part in those historical settings. And there was also the parkour mechanics. You weren't just walking around those streets and looking at things from down below. You had the freedom to climb those iconic historical landmarks. But as an assassin, its stealth is essential when you get to places that you shouldn't be. You had to stay out of sight, investigate targets, and take your time to plan your attack strategy. You felt powerful as a dangerous and highly trained assassin, but not to the point of someone who just runs through and deals with everything that's moving, but rather you had to be careful and use your tools and knowledge to get the best results. And those early games certainly were a great example of how you can mix storytelling with creative gameplay and a playful reimagining of historical settings. No one's going to call those games a documentary, but they were grounded enough that the events didn't seem all that absurd and actually looked way more interesting. The historical landmarks were impressively recreated, and the fact that you had real-life figures in the games, such as Leonardo da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, and Machiavelli, just made things much more interesting and engaging. The mechanics kept evolving, and those early games established a strong foundation for the franchise. Assassin's Creed had a blueprint, but by this point in the 7th gen, we already had 5 different entries in the franchise, and the formulaic approach was already something to worry about. So where could they go next? To be fair, after Desmond's story was over in Assassin's Creed 3, Ubisoft still had a surprise for us. The following game, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, is set in the golden age of piracy and brings a really interesting and well-fitting mechanic, naval combat. It was a great game with interesting characters and a well-developed story. It would also be the first Assassin's Creed game released for the PS4 and Xbox One, but Ubisoft still had one last chapter for the 7th gen. And Assassin's Creed Rogue would be their last game for the 360 and the PS Triple. For a franchise that had started at the beginning of that generation, it was already the 7th game in the series. It received average reviews and it's definitely not a fan favorite, but by now it was time to move to the 8th gen of consoles and everyone was looking forward to what would come next, to how Ubisoft would take advantage of the new hardware. Around that time, the main complaints were about the repetitive approach, not only in gameplay and mission design but also in storytelling. and Assassin's Creed Unity would be the first game made for the new consoles set during the French Revolution. To its credit, it had great visuals and incredible attention to detail, and the sheer amount of NPCs walking around made Paris feel alive and convincing. Its movement and traversal mechanics are some of the most satisfying in the franchise, but the frenetic pace in which Ubisoft was coming up with new entries in the series would eventually come to collect its price. Assassin's Creed Unity had so many bugs during release that Ubisoft had to issue an apology and a free DLC as a form of compensation. Despite those issues, and once again, average scores, it sold well, but the bad look caused by the amount of bugs wouldn't be easy to forget. It also did not feel revolutionary or super remarkable, which did not hype the release of the following game, Assassin's Creed Syndicate. It was set in London during the Second Industrial Revolution, and it did bring in some interesting concepts like carriage rides, gangs, as well as 2 different main characters. And to be fair, I don't think Rogue, Unity, and Syndicate are as bad as some people claim. But we were now talking about the 9th entry in a series in a span of just 2 console generations. So it's no surprise that the series was feeling stagnated. Missions, objectives, and world design felt repetitive over time, and we also had a few unsatisfying endings as well. To make matters worse, Ubisoft continued with the annual releases, which did nothing to prevent the overall stagnation and fatigue that everyone was already feeling. So we now have a series that feels stagnated, formulaic, and repetitive. What is Ubisoft going to do next? Option A, let the series rest for a while, or Option B, transition the game towards a huge open-world action RPG. Of course they went with the Option B. This shift changed Assassin's Creed forever, from a stealth-based game with well-crafted open worlds and parkour elements to essentially an action RPG with skill trees, loot mechanics, and lots of side quests. I'm not saying those are awful games, but these changes impacted not only the gameplay loop but also the overall experience. Assassin's Creed went from a much more story-focused game that you could complete in about 15 to 20 hours to this much grander scheme of quests and side quests that could take you from 30 to 60 hours to complete. To be fair, I'm a big fan of Origins and Odyssey. I love the setting of ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, as well as the side characters, and I'm almost a bit ashamed to say that I have more than 200 hours combined in those 2 games. But when it came to Valhalla, it only took me 11 hours to feel like I've had enough. What's funny is that Valhalla is actually one of the best-selling games in the series, but I feel like it's a case of the right game in the right setting at the right time, as well as lots of sales and buyer's remorse. And when we look at those games as a package, the playtime would be considerably extended. We went from 30 hours in Origins to about 45 hours in Odyssey to the 61 hours needed to complete Valhalla. Upgrades weren't necessarily something new, but we went from basic unlocks and crafting systems to fully fledged skill trees, perks, and upgrades. Traversal mechanics were also simplified, and when it came to combat, there was a much bigger focus on parrying, dodging, and using different types of attacks, as stealth was no longer as central as it used to be. There was also quite a lot of grind, as well as a level up system and recommended levels for certain missions, and more microtransaction options, which didn't feel that aggressive, but still it was a clear sign of the new direction. And perhaps the biggest mistake here was the use of the Assassin's Creed brand, and if those games were presented as historical RPGs under a different name, things could be different. And I still want to give another chance to Valhalla with that kind of logic, but they clearly wanted to use the well-established IP as much as possible. But for the following game in the series, they decided once again to make a slight change in direction, with Assassin's Creed Mirage serving as a shorter, more focused experience. It was a throwback to the early games, with stealth playing a more central role and set in the 9th century Baghdad. But it was far from being anything remarkable or revolutionary in the franchise. And then we finally had the reveal that most fans had been waiting for a long time. The next Assassin's Creed game would finally take place in feudal Japan. Now, the first issue here is that a few years prior, Ghost of Tsushima had done an incredible job of scratching that itch of what an Assassin's Creed would look like in Japan. So it's not like all the hype had died down, but now it had a recent masterpiece to be compared with. And then we had the initial trailers, with 2 main characters, Naoi and Yasuke. The backlash was almost instant, and this isn't a drama channel, so I'm not going to cover every back and forth between people defending it and people criticizing it. And also, the concept of having 2 different characters, as one being a shinobi and the other being a samurai, is nothing too complex to understand. But when it comes to the samurai chosen for this game, I'm just going to say this. Close your eyes and think about a game set in feudal Japan. Who do you see yourself playing with? A main character that looks like Tom Cruise or Yasuke, or a main character that looks like Jin Sakai from Ghost of Tsushima? If you're being honest with me, you are going to say Jin Sakai, or at least the vast majority will say this. And the real tragedy is that Yasuke could actually be a very interesting side character, with a branch of quests that could tell his story and pay tribute to what he represented, and that could be done in a really tasteful manner. And despite what you think of this choice, if it was a step in the wrong direction, or if it's just gamers overreacting about diversity or anything like that, I believe the Tokyo Game Show was a prime example that Ubisoft is not confident in what they did. If you are making a game about a certain country and you feel really proud about how you are representing such a culture, you would never miss a chance to showcase that game in front of that very audience. But we've just had the Tokyo Game Show and Ubisoft not only cancelled their presentation, but they also delayed the game until next year. And I really don't think we're going to see any huge changes to the game for one reason. They delayed the release for a few months and you can't make structural changes in such a short time. I also don't think they're going to replace Yasuke or anything like that, and I would actually find it disrespectful if they went that way, so at this point I hope that they don't do it. But I think the delay feels like a step in the right direction. I imagine they are going to double check everything and make sure that no flag or armor from a different era is present in the game, and the hip hop beat while Yasuke is in combat is likely going away as well. Generally, I would say that it wouldn't surprise me if this game actually sold somewhat okay, because Assassin's Creed still is a huge franchise and everyone was waiting for a game like that in Japan. But then we've had all the backlash and the fact that Ghost of Tsushima not only set a high bar, but also with the delay to 2025, Shadows will also have to compete with Ghost of Yotei. And it's also important to point out that this video isn't even a deep dive into all the plot holes that were never properly explained during all those different games. And that actually presents another issue to the franchise, as the story took a huge hit with so many releases and changes in direction. When we look at the failure of Star Wars Outlaws and the current state of Assassin's Creed, it becomes clear that even a strong franchise in Ubisoft's hand is no longer enough to secure solid numbers, and that is particularly worrying for a company that relies on big names to guarantee success. Looking at Assassin's Creed, we see a story of milking a cash cow, following trends, and a clear lack of direction. What was once an innovative series has turned into a commercialized product that seems to be losing its identity release after release. And things don't really get any better when we look at the new IPs that Ubisoft has recently put on the market. X-Defiant was their attempt to break into the arena shooter free-to-play scene, but failed to deliver the dividends Ubisoft had hoped for. And Skull and Bones, which according to Ubisoft is a quadruple-A game, feels like a worse version of Assassin's Creed Black Flag and didn't manage to capture an audience. Adding to these issues, we've also seen reports of toxic positivity within Ubisoft's corporate culture. They'll classify any backlash as bullying or just haters being haters, refusing to address the valid points being raised by their audience. And considering that Ubisoft is actually a publicly traded company, there is no better place to look at the result of all those actions than its current stock price. And it really shows that this new focus, literally speaking, is not paying off. In the past, Ubisoft innovations were focused on gameplay, storytelling, and historical settings. They come up with interesting new IPs, they added interesting characters, and made their worlds feel more and more impressive. But over time, those innovations were replaced by different monetization strategies. These corporate priorities, along with their strategy of cramming as many games as possible into year-after-year releases, have led to the decline of their franchises' identities. But as the stock price makes it clear, this approach isn't doing them any favors. The decline of Assassin's Creed is a cautionary tale of a franchise that lost its way. What began as a creative series with innovative gameplay, rich storytelling, and a focus on stealth and historical settings has become a bloated, generic action RPG. The core identity of being an assassin has faded, replaced by an experience that is shaped by chasing trends and catering to the broadest possible audience. This decline also hints at larger issues within Ubisoft. A constant pursuit of growth and profit has led to an over-reliance on established franchises, annualized releases, and a focus on monetization over meaningful innovation. This is clear not only in Assassin's Creed, but also in other Ubisoft franchises like Far Cry and Watch Dogs, which have suffered a similar declining fate. Ubisoft's dismissive response to fan criticism only makes it worse. Instead of acknowledging valid concerns, executives have tried to shift the blame onto players, complaining that gamers are expecting extraordinary experiences, which further illustrates a disconnect between the company and its audience. And while Assassin's Creed certainly retains a dedicated fan base and remains a relevant IP, its current trajectory might be unsustainable. The franchise needs time to breathe, to rediscover its core identity, and to prioritize the quality of things to do rather than the amount of things to do. And as a longtime fan, perhaps it's best to let the franchise rest for a while. But as we live in the age of remakes and remasters, and it's clear that Ubisoft loves chasing trends, it wouldn't surprise me if the next step for the series is actually going back in time and remaking those early games. Both Assassin's Creed and Ubisoft need fresh ideas, innovative gameplay mechanics, and a commitment to quality over quantity. Until then, the franchise risks fading into a shadow, no pun intended, of its former self, a victim of its own success and the industry's insatiable appetite for growth. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and also drop a like and leave a comment. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.